Hi everyone, I want to welcome you to this week's episode of the Lesson in 5. Lesson in 5 is a weekly program where we summarize the Sabbath School Lesson into 5 main points. If you're new around here, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our future videos. The Sabbath School Lesson for this week is Education in Worship. We all have an innate ability or an innate desire to worship. All of us as created beings seek to worship. Unfortunately, that desire has been distorted by sin, and so we tend to worship many other things, but God has created that desire in us, and it's that desire to worship that we want to explore in our lesson this week. We all worship something. Think about it. All of us, because we've got this innate desire to worship, have an object that we worship. What we worship may differ. Some people worship God, other people worship self. Some people bow and pledge allegiance to gods like sex, power, wealth, and the list can go on and on. But we as human beings are all worshippers. God in heaven calls us to worship Him. If you're not worshiping God, you're worshiping something. But when you worship God and give Him your full allegiance, that's the best way to live as a human being. If you want to experience a full and abundant life, worship God and give Him glory. And declare them to their children. When we read Psalm 78, we come across some very interesting words. Somewhere the psalmist Asaph refers to teaching children the dark lessons. Dark doesn't mean dark as in shady or something that is sinister. Rather, dark in context means those lessons that are beginning to fade. We need to go back to the archives and teach our children the good old path, the sweet old truths, the truths that have held us true for so long. We need to go back to the Bible and ensure that we are passing the lessons that are in Scripture to the next generation. In spirit and truth. Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman. In speaking to this woman at the well, He says to her that there is a time that is coming when people are not going to worship God either on this or that mountain. That means worship wasn't just about geographical location, but Jesus says that the day is coming when people will worship God in spirit and in truth. Why is this important? Because our worship of God needs to come from the heart. We need to worship God as an expression of our endless, undying love for Him. So worship has to be in spirit. But worship in spirit needs to be balanced out by worship in truth. The truth is important as well. Spirit without truth just becomes a head empty kind of experience. Worship with only truth becomes a dry formalism. So we need to have both in our worship of God, both enthusiasm that comes from spirit and the brain that comes with truth. The beauty of holiness. 1 Chronicles 16 records the moment when the ark was put in the temple in Jerusalem. After it had been captured and now returned to Jerusalem, returned to the temple, they all break out in praise. And a beautiful line is recorded in that psalm. It says, worship the Lord in the beauty of His holiness. You see, the God we worship requires our devotion. But there is no God who is quite like our God. All other gods who are around Israel required weird things like child sacrifices, required to be appeased by the people. But God can be worshipped in the beauty of His holiness. We can stand in awe of our God and marvel not only at his justice, but his love, not only at his truth, but at his grace. We can stand in awe of the presence of God and worship him in the beauty of his holiness. Idolatry in worship. The nations which surrounded Israel were very idolatrous nations. They worshipped idols and many different kinds of gods and were involved in weird practices. God wanted his people to be safeguarded from this kind of worship. Many times as God's people, we are in danger of conforming to the patterns of the world. Jesus, speaking in Mark, speaks about how people worship God in vain, but their hearts are far from God. True worship happens when we are strongly connected to God, when we have a thriving relationship with God. We need to learn to worship God from our hearts and worship God because we love him. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lesson in 5. If you've enjoyed the Lesson in 5, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. Also, put in a comment. Those comments really help to keep me going. Really like to thank everybody who is subscribed. Thank you so much. The channel is growing phenomenally, and God bless you all. See you next week.